We have a really fun gift for you this summer. It is our 30-day prayer guide to a fruitful summer season of bounty, rest, sunshine, fellowship, and growth. All you gotta do is be signed up for our newsletter or go to gospelspice.com/free to claim it today. It's our gift to you.
Bonjour, and welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast, infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture to spice up your relationship with God. Here is your host, Stéphanie Roussel.
All right, we have much to cover today, so we're going to pick up right where we left off. We are in the second part of our study of the two French words for hope, espoir and espérance. And if you're just joining us this week, or if you missed last week's episode, you absolutely need to listen to it first, because otherwise today's episode is not going to make a whole lot of sense outside of the context. So make sure to catch last week's, where I'm explaining the biblical foundation for those two French words, espoir and espérance, and how they both are translated hope in English, but there's just so much more when you dig into that. So I'm diving right back in. Make sure you've listened, because I want to talk to you, like I promised last week, about the golden thread that exists in French, all the way from Job all the way to Timothy. And to start, I want to propose to you that God is the ultimate wordsmith. I am convinced that He orchestrated Scripture to be translatable in all of the languages of Babel in order to unite mankind under the banner of hope in Him. Now, why am I mentioning Babel? Because, well, it's in Genesis 11, and that's where God confuses the language of man. Man had been speaking only one language until that point, and he confuses all the languages, which is how the root languages for English or French and all the other languages were created. They didn't speak French or English that day. It was the roots of those proto-primitive languages originally, but eventually that evolved into English or French that we have today. But in Genesis 11, God is not allowing men to rely on their language. He is hoping to teach them to learn to rely on Him. And it's a point they do not accept lightly, and they rebel. And that's a story for another day. But my point here, through the languages of Babel that were created that day, is that I suspect that God took pleasure in weaving hidden golden threads in His word that are revealed only to those seekers among us who speak a common language. And I think it's incredibly poetic and very much like God to create unity out of Babel itself. In other words, through this unity, He is increasing His glory through Babel, which was our rebellion in some ways. So here's and there's some gold threads in language that are only available to native English speakers. And it's a joy to learn English for me and to discover them. But sometimes, as we're going to see today, there's a French-only golden thread. And by French only, I mean not in English. Maybe in other languages. Obviously, I don't speak all the other languages. So with a lot of humility, I want to present to you the only two places in all of Scripture, Old and New, where both espoir and espérance are found in the same sentence. Now, the first thing I love is that there's only two verses in all of Scripture that have both espoir and espérance in the same sentence. One of them is in the Old Testament, and one of them is in the New Testament. Isn't that just so poetic and orderly already? This speaks to me of the intricate weaving of God's seamless word. I mean, no human could make that up. I'm just in awe right now. So let me give them to you before I wax too lyrical here. In Job in 17:15 asks, "Where then is my hope?" And that's the word espoir. And he goes on, "Who can see any hope, espérance, for me?" So that's Job 17:15. So where is my hope, espoir? Who can see any hope, espérance, for me? That's a man in despair. And then in 1 Timothy 6:17 in the NIV, Paul tells Timothy, his protégé, "Do not put your hope, espoir, in riches, but put your hope, espérance, in God." All right, so Job and Timothy. Except for the book of the Psalms, the Psalter, the book of Job boasts the most mentions of both the words espoir and espérance. And that makes sense because Job is in such despair. One of the key themes in the book of Job is the quest for true hope. He's not going to settle for wishful thinking. And so Job is after espérance. So no wonder one of the rare mentions of espérance in the Old Testament is they're mostly in the book of Job, really. So through Paul's pen, God elaborates on his answer to Job. So God answers Job at the end of the book of Job, Job 38 to 41. But I think that through Paul, God is giving a little additional answer to Job here. Let me show you what I mean here. Job is asking, where then is my hope, espoir? That's the first half of his question. While Paul answers, do not put your hope, espoir, in riches. So these two are espoir, and they're in order, same verse, one verse each, and first half of the verse. But then Job asks another question. Who can see any hope, espérance, for me? And Paul answers, put your hope, espérance, in God. Do you see how these two verses echo one another? Job has two questions. Paul has two answers. Job's two questions each use espoir and then espérance in turn, only mentioned in the Old Testament of those two in the same verse. And then Paul's answer is a twofold answer that uses first the first word espoir and then the second word for hope is espérance, only mentioned in the New Testament. You can't, it can't be a coincidence. God's word is too intricately, beautifully written for this to be a coincidence. So I see this as God's tender care for the heart of Job and for any one of us who needs to cultivate hope, the true hope of espérance. So Paul provides us here with the key to Job's quest. Espérance is in God alone, not in the world. Do not put your hope, espoir, in the world, but put your hope, espérance, in God. Let's not place our hope in the riches of this world. Honestly, espoir is all this world can offer you. It's a puff of wind. It's unicorn fairy dust, we said last week. But espérance can be seen, as Job implies, even if it is by God alone. And Paul agrees with that. Our espérance will only be rightfully placed when it is placed in God alone. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of Bible trivia for context. Job is traditionally considered the oldest book in the Bible, written by Moses or alongside the Pentateuch, mostly. But conversely, 1 Timothy is usually dated around 62 or 64 BC, and Paul is believed to have died in anywhere from 64 to 67, and that makes his letters to Timothy some of his last writings from prison. So 1 Timothy is among Paul's last letters, just like Job is the oldest book of the New Testament. So it's the two extremes in the chronology. Job is the oldest, and First Timothy is right there among the youngest, if you will. So it's really the entire breadth of Scripture chronologically from Job to Timothy. What I'm trying to tell you is that from the oldest book of the Bible to one of the newest, quote unquote, espoir and espérance are contrasted as the two ways of life that we are faced with. The ways of the world or the ways of the Lord. From Job to Timothy, to you and me, the question is as relevant as ever. Are we going to weave our life with the fool's gold of espoir or with the imperishable gold of espérance? That's the gold thread that I want to share with you in French. Now, I haven't just shared that with you because I've been wondering what happens to a culture that chooses fool's gold of espoir. And so I asked a few French friends and family members about the difference between espoir and espérance, and my Christian French friends joyfully agreed with everything I've shared with you in accordance with the online research I've done, that espoir and espérance are different and that espérance is what I described it to be. But a very dear loved one who is absolutely not a Christian, who is steeped in postmodern philosophies and a post-truth culture, this person described both words espoir and espérance with the exact opposite definition. This is what this person said, and that's my translation because obviously the conversation was in French. This person said, espérance is a theoretical concept limited to religious speak. There's no basis for believing that any of the object of your espérance will ever come to pass. Just like the concept of faith, quote unquote, it's a human invention. Oh, that made me so sad. This statement, it sadly sums up the state-of-the-art, quote-unquote, spirituality in our 21st century. Out of respect for this person, whom I love deeply, I'm not going to name them, but this is someone who's considered wise by many, and not least in their own eyes. This person is sought after for counsel and advice. I find it very concerning that the epitome of wisdom, quote-unquote, absolutely negates espérance. What a world we have come to. And I'm not sure I am sure you too have people like this, dear one, in your own circles. So how do you engage with them in love and truth? Oh, Lord, give us wisdom. Now, ultra-postmodern French philosophy culture is so far removed from the concept of knowing anything for certain in this life that the very notion has progressively been erased from the cultural psyche. Absolute truth is archaic and meaningless and is fully replaced with authoritative relative truth. You've seen it. The only truth is that nothing can be known as true. Well, except that statement, of course, right? Insert sarcastic emoji, right? The only thing that you can know for sure is that you can't know anything for sure. I mean, like, hello. Relative truth is now so entrenched in the culture that the common people don't even have a category of thought for espérance to inhabit in French. And so espérance has joined absolute truth in the homelessness of antiquated irrelevance in our 21st century. That's very Parisian. See, not all things French are good. I mean, I love Paris as a city, but I'm not sure I love everything it symbolizes in terms of philosophy and faith. So what does the extinction of espérance mean? What happens to a world that has no espérance? What happens to a person who does not have espérance as a category of thought, as a beacon of light and hope? What happens when the only kind of hope you can cling to is basically wishful thinking and counting on your lucky stars? That's the world we live in. Espérance has been exiled from the thought world, and that eliminates the glory that she brought with her, the hope of glory at the hands of a loving Savior. Espérance is solely and firmly grounded in Christ, and her disappearance signals a much bigger problem we have. It's the removal of all notion of Jesus from the culture. It's a culture that banishes espérance to embrace espoir. It's fool's gold. It's fool's gold. It is all that espoir can give when espérance is gone. Oh, now, espérance is gone, but it's not dead. There's a difference. God is God, whether he's acknowledged as such or not. And in the same way, espérance is real and alive, whether people know her or not. Apart from Christ, espérance is indeed a very foolish notion. When Christ is rejected or ridiculed or considered at best a good teacher, espérance is sure to die. And so today, espérance has very little place in French spiritual matters. Well, that is, except for the glorious remnant of French Christians who bravely keep her alive in their hearts and in their homeland. I think there's 4 times as many spiritists in France and mediums and like tarot card readers as there are pastors. Imagine that. But there are French Christians and they need your prayers. Now, that word espérance that those French Christians are clinging to and that is bringing such life to them, that is a word that obviously Satan has been attacking. And that is no wonder. I mean, no wonder that Satan would attack a word that threatens him so. Satan will gladly offer you the counterfeit gold every time that he can exile the true treasure of espérance. He doesn't mind you having a lot of espoir. He just doesn't want you to have espérance. Because espérance is the herald of a glorious world. It's the kingdom of God. Now, espérance, it might be in mustard seed size, but it is It is not dead. Espérance is a mustard seed in France, and there is great hope for what that mustard seed is going to do. Make no mistake, my friend, Espérance is alive and well. Espérance is reserved to our glorious Lord and Savior, whether my beloved French compatriots know it or not. I hope you've enjoyed our time together on hope and espérance, and I want to bring your attention to the second part of our episode. And I've told you I would sometimes digress a bit and use a French expression, and today I want to use a French thinker and philosopher and mathematician, someone you've probably heard of and who spoke into the issues of the Parisian Enlightenment and the loss of espérance back when it all started in the 16th and 17th centuries. You know his name, Blaise Pascal. I'm going to give you a few highlights about him that you're probably familiar with, and then we'll dig into a little bit of who he is, just for your own encouragement, and if you're wondering who he is. So some highlights about him: his conversion experience with that word fire that you may have heard of, and the famous pensées, which are thoughts. He wrote over 920 thoughts. That's the French word is pensée. And the most famous one is probably the one you've heard of, is the heart has its reasons that reason knows not. And we'll get into what that really means, because it has nothing to do with matters of love and choosing a romantic partner, actually, even though that's what people think it means. And then the third thing he might be familiar to you for is the famous wager. The wager that it's safer to bet on God, and Pascal's wager that, if you are not so sure, if you have doubts, you'd rather err on the side of faith rather than on the side of unbelief, which is so different from how the world sees faith these days. And these were his theological conclusions based on his scientific research on gambling, of all things. So we're going to look at these three things in context of his life and theology. And why him? Because he seems to be one of those great minds who's quoted on a few things, yet he's largely unknown by those who mention him. You may know him for those three things, so I want you to give some context. Am I personally a fan of Blaise Pascal? I don't know. It's a complicated answer, and it's besides the point. What I think doesn't really matter. What I want to invite you into is the life and mind of someone who deeply influenced the 17th century French literary and religious scenes, and someone who has something to say to every generation of Christians, especially when it comes to hope. Now, do I agree with him theologically? On some points, yes. On others, I think he's honestly way too smart and educated for me, and I would not even know whether to agree or disagree with him. So with a lot of humility, I want to talk to you about someone who experienced a lot of despair in life, and that led him to a firm hold-on espérance. One thing I do love about him is his passion for God, his unwavering devotion to the one who completely turned his life around. So a quick biography, just so you understand who we're talking about. He was born in the middle of France, not in Paris, though he lived in Paris most of his adult life, from an upper middle class family. He was born in 1623. His family were people of substance, of that upper middle class. His dad was a government official, and when he died, he gave him and his two daughters quite a bit of money. So Blaise had a lifestyle of ease and wealth as long as the three siblings, he and his two sisters, lived together. One of them, Jacqueline, is going to be influential, and I'll talk to you about her in a minute. Now, Blaise Pascal is his last name, Blaise is his first name, was extremely brilliant. He had an extremely precocious mind. He applied himself to studies in childhood and in adolescence to such an extreme that he actually suffered from health issues. And he died at the age of 39, a very early death due to health issues that had to do with the amount of studies he did very early on in life. He was a mathematician. He might actually be considered the father of the probability theory based on gambling. He was not interested in gambling as a gambler. He was not a gambler, but he was interested in the statistics that gambling provided. His great interest in probabilities come from his lifelong mathematician friends and conversations. He invented the calculator. He is considered the Chinese did, but he did a Middle Ages, 17th century late Renaissance period ancestor of the calculator that you can look up online. It's pretty nifty. He's counted as one of the greatest physicists, mathematicians of all time. And all of his discoveries were made at a young age. He died at 39, which is when most mathematicians are still apprentices and pupils. And he was already making incredible discoveries. So really a genius. In physics, as an engineer, another fun little bit of trivia, he invented the first Parisian bus system. It was called the carrosse à cinq sols because it was basically a bunch of carriages that would go on specific lines and always follow the same routes, and people could pay 5 sols, a few pennies, to ride those early carriages, the ancient bus system. He became a believer in 1654. He was age 31 and he would live to 39. So he wasn't a believer for a long time, but that's what he's famous for. He was not a theologian. He was heavily influenced by an extreme Puritan current, the Jansenists. He took part in polemics raging between Jesuits and Jansenists about free will and predestination, which is interesting because there's absolutely nothing new, right? Numerous theologians have tried to understand, but the balance between free will and predestination is a mystery which we can perceive but can't truly understand. So, it's actually the problem they had at that time is that there were two camps, and both probably falling into a little bit of an extreme, somewhat heretical teaching, because when there's excess or deviation to one side or the other on the issue of free will and predestination, you can quickly go to heresy, like the Pelagians, who were refuted by Augustine. They emphasized human effort and they neglected grace. And then on the other extreme, the Calvinists, much later on, emphasized the degradation of man through original sin and considered that mankind was so corrupt that the will was basically useless. And that's the doctrine of predestination of a 5-point Calvinist even today in some circles. But it was upon the doctrine of grace that Augustine developed that the Jansenists relied on. And they thought they were relying his views most accurately, and I think they were proven maybe a little bit wrong on that, and that's still up for debate today. Now, the nemesis of Blaise Pascal was Montaigne, who had lived about a generation before him in the late 1500s. Montaigne is one of the ultimate, most brilliant minds of the French culture. He was able to put into universal words the experience of doubt within faith that everyone experiences at some point. And even though Pascal tried to demolish Montaigne, again, living a generation after him, it's interesting how Pascal ends up sounding a whole lot like his nemesis Montaigne. And so it's interesting how, philosophers would argue with the ones that were before them. And so Pascal would try to demolish Montaigne, who was a generation before him, and then someone tried to demolish Pascal a generation after Pascal, a name Voltaire. That was Pascal's post-death greatest adversary, Voltaire, who lived about a generation after Pascal. And he was never able to cancel, quote-unquote, Pascal, despite his best efforts. The atheist Voltaire was no match for Pascal's brilliance and passionate faith. Now, like I said, Pascal lived until he was 39, and his sister Jacqueline entered a convent when she left him. They had lived together for a while and they could share the family money, the family estate. But then when Jacqueline left, she took her part of the inheritance with her, which forced Blaise Pascal to live in more poverty than he wanted to. And that was part of his story. He had maybe a mental health struggle, definitely struggled with depression, despair, disillusion. And that's not an illustration of personal weakness, because they're perfectly objective. They're essential moments in the progress of our soul. And, this dark night of the soul that many of us go through, it's an essential stage in the progress of our spiritual life. So let me tell you about the Night of Fire. It was November 23rd, 1654, and Pascal was home alone. Around 10:30 at night, something supernatural happened. It's not clear exactly what he saw, but the mystical experience lasted for about 90 minutes. He made a note of it, which he kept always with him, and it was found after his death, sewn into the coat which he was wearing. And that note starts with the word fire, feu. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not the God of the philosophers and the learned. And then he goes on and, it's a pretty short text. He says, certitude, feeling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ, my God and your God. Your God will be my God. Forgetfulness of the world and of everything except God. He is only found by the ways taught in the gospel. Grandeur of the human soul. Righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you. Joy, 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 tears of joy. And then he goes on to quote a few other things, including Psalm 118. And he ends with, may I not forget your words. Amen. And I invite you to, it's a short note. You can find it online. And it's interesting because his last words on his deathbed are, may God never abandon me, which is an echo of this experience. And that's taken from Psalm 22. And Psalm 22, like Psalm 118, had a considerable influence in his life. And as you heard from the passage I read to you, it's really basically from John 17, Jesus' high priestly prayer. So while this all happened on his conversion night, Blaise Pascal knew his scriptures before he was converted, but this mystical experience led him to revere the words of Jesus and to change completely his own faith. Faith became personal and defined Blaise Pascal from that point forward. And he moved from a focus on math and physics to a focus on faith. And he was never a theologian, but he was a philosopher, and he embraced Jansenism, which I shared about before, which isn't very much around anymore, which is an extreme form of Calvinism. And it had to do with God's grace versus human freedom. And so he really did not believe in any kind of human freedom, but completely relying on God's grace in a very extreme form of what Augustine would teach. Now, the wager. Again, I'm trying to go fast, so I've talked to you about the Night of Fire and his history with it, and then now I want to talk about the wager and then end mostly with the pensée. The wager, briefly, it's a pretty simple concept. It makes more sense if you have any doubt to believe rather than not. If God exists, you win. If God doesn't exist, you don't lose. And that's based on the probability theory that he developed very early on in life. And it's used in argument against doubt, and he used it a lot against Montaigne, his arch nemesis from a generation before him. Part of Blaise Pascal's system of apologetics was to force people to think, to reject superstition, to reject tradition, and to embrace faith. So the wager is really this invitation to think for yourself. It's based on Pensée 236. Like I said, there's over 900 of them, and they're just numbered, which isn't very very pleasant, I guess, but that's how it is. So Pensée, thought 236 is, and I'm going to read it to you in an English translation. According to the doctrine of chance, you ought to put yourself to the trouble of searching for the truth. For if you die without worshiping the true cause, that's a name for God, you're lost. But, say you, if he had wished me to worship him, he would have left me signs of his will. Oh, but he has done so. But you neglect them. Seek them, therefore, it is well worth it. So that's one of the pensées that is rooted around the wager, the Pascalian wager that is familiar. Speaking of that, I'm going to go straight to the pensées. So that's one of the pensées. There's over 900 of them. I'm going to read a few and give you my own thoughts, pensées on them super briefly, because I think I just want you to ponder them. They're very much like Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, where you have, pithy little statements and you just ponder them. That's what the pensées are. Some of them are maybe a page long, others are one sentence. So I'll read some of the shorter ones. And those pensées, that word thought, it's the name given after his death to these fragments that Pascal had been preparing as he wanted to write an opus on an apology for the Christian faith, apologetics, so an explanation and a defense of the Christian faith. And it was never completed. And that work that he was hoping to do is often referred to as, I quote, the apology for the Christian religion. But Pascal never used that title, and it was never finished. So it's an unfinished work. All we have are those little post-it notes, if you will, that he wrote, 900 of them, 920 of them. And that's what they're published as, really basically post-it notes of the 17th century. So they're the first notes for a work that he left far from completed. And one of Pascal's biographers, Sainte-Beuve, calls those pensées, I quote, a tower of which the stones have been laid on each other, but not cemented, and the structure is unfinished. End of quote. Very loose paraphrase quote. And so those pensées are ideas and jottings that are incomplete. And he had probably planned the order of the book, and he had begun the task of cutting and pasting his draft notes into a form, but that's incomplete. And so no one is able to truly know the order in which he was hoping to publish this. So the way they're published is really somewhat haphazard. I've put a few more of them in the show notes for you to consider. And so here's a sample, and I'm going to end with this, with a brief commentary on them. Thought 253, two extremes, to exclude reason or to admit reason only. That's it. That's the pensée. To exclude reason and to admit reason are two extremes. Think of it. I'll let you ponder that one for yourself. It sounds very much like a biblical Solomonic proverb, doesn't it? Two extremes are to exclude reason or to admit reason only. So what he's saying is reason is essential, but reason is not all there is. Which is, again, it was what the Enlightenment was teaching, that reason was all there is. And so Blaise Pascal is fighting the teachings of the Enlightenment. And you can see already, if you know Voltaire at all, why Voltaire would hate him so much. Next pensée, 257. It's a bit longer. There are only three kinds of persons: those who serve God, having found him; others who are occupied in seeking him, not having found him; while the remainder live without seeking him and without having found him. The first are reasonable and happy. The last are foolish and unhappy. Those between are unhappy and reasonable. Can you hear the mathematician in there? He's classifying people and he is describing what their state is. So those who are serving God because they found him, they are reasonable and happy. And again, you see again reason being essential. So that's the first category of people. And that's hopefully you and me. We serve God because we found him. So we're reasonable and happy. And then there's those who are looking for him, but they haven't found him yet. And these are unhappy because they haven't found him yet, but they're reasonable because they're looking for him. And the rest, they're not seeking and they haven't found him. And they're foolish because they're not seeking and they don't have him, so they're unhappy. Do you see that? It's so simple and yet so profound. Next thought, 265. Faith indeed tells what the senses do not tell, but not the contrary of what they see. It is above them and not contrary to them. Now, faith, what Pascal here is saying is that faith tells us more than what our five senses can tell us. But faith never says something that is contrary to what our five senses can tell us. Faith gives us something beyond and above what our five senses can tell us, but never in contradiction to it, which sounds like such a modern thought. But here, there you go, 17th century French dude here. 267, the last proceeding of reason is to recognize that there is an infinity of things which are beyond it. It is but feeble if it does not see so far as to know this. But if natural things are beyond it, what will be said of supernatural? Oh, I love this one. So in other words, he is almost tongue-in-cheek, and he's so polemical against the putting of reason on a pedestal, which again, we live in a culture that is the descendant of the Enlightenment, where reason is everything, even though we are coming into a post-truth, post-reason generation for sure. Our generation is probably the first to actually agree with Blaise Pascal, but in a way that completely negates faith, which is a whole other thing in apologetics nowadays. But here, Pascal is saying that being reasonable, being full of reason, having reason as your anchor will necessarily lead you to realize that reason does not have all the answers. There's so much more beyond reason, so much more beyond what the five senses can tell us, what our minds can tell us. Because if we rely on reason and our minds are finite, therefore we cannot know all things. And it's only reasonable to realize that reason doesn't explain everything. And then if we can't even understand all things by reason that are natural, how much more of the supernatural? If there's things within the realm of the universe that we can't understand with reason, and there are, then how much more the things of God? So he's saying how faith is superior to reason, but they go together in hand. I love this so much. So a couple more. If we submit everything to reason, our religion will have no mysterious and supernatural element. If we offend the principles of reason, our religion will be absurd and ridiculous. So if we only have reason, or religion or faith will have no mystery, nothing supernatural. But if we don't believe in reason, and if we don't apply reason, then our religion is going to be absurd and ridiculous. So we need reason, but we also need to know it's not enough. Now, 277, the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. We were talking, that's the famous one, right? He says, we feel it in 1,000 things. I say that the heart naturally loves God and also itself naturally, according as it gives itself to them, and it hardens itself against one or the other as its will. You have rejected the one and kept the other. Is it by reason that you love yourself? So see, he's not saying, the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know, as an excuse to describe the mystery when you fall in a romantic relationship that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, which is how we often understand it today. But that's not at all what Blaise is talking about here. He's saying that reason is not the best way to approach and to experience God, and that faith is necessary. Now, these thoughts, all these pensées, can't be detached from one another and quoted as if they were complete in and of itself. And this one, le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point, the heart has its reasons which reason does not know, is the most famous of them. It's so often been quoted for the wrong purpose. It's not an exaltation of the heart over the head. It's not a defense of the absence of reason. For Pascal, the heart is truly rational. If it is truly the heart and reason go hand in hand. He would even say they overlap. They're the same thing ultimately. For him, when it comes to theology, and he considered theology, I think, to be much more difficult and much larger and more important than science. In theology, he basically says the whole personality is involved. The heart and the reason, the mind and the heart, the brain and the heart, all of that is involved. And there's a few more that I, would love to share with you, but I think we're completely out of time, so I'll put them in the show notes. What I want you to hear is that Pascal remains humble in his genius. He never says to you and me as his readers that, look at me. I am, one of the most famous and smartest scientists of my day, and I understand many things which you will never understand because you're not as smart as me. And it took me science to come to faith. And so therefore, you who do not understand science really well, you should have faith because I have faith and I came to faith through science. Now, he's not saying this at all. He's talking with a lot of humility, and he's also understanding that there's a difference between science and faith. And we can't say that one cannot coexist with the other. They live together, hand in hand. He really differentiates science and faith, and he says they can completely cohabitate. The reason and faith go hand in hand. And for that, he's really famous, and he has been influential in our understanding of faith today. I hope this helped you, and I hope it helps you see how hope, espérance, is rooted in reason and in faith, both.
Hi, Jonah here. Thank you for being part of the Gospel Spice family. If you've enjoyed this episode, you will love receiving our newsletter. It contains value-packed free gifts and rich content each month. It's at gospelspice.com/sign-up. There is always something new and exciting happening around here, and I don't want you to miss out. Sign up at gospelspice.com/sign-up. Did you know Gospel Spice has a YouTube channel? There's exclusive content there too, so join Gospel Spice on YouTube. Also, please give us a star rating and a comment on your podcast listening app. Your reviews actually really do make a difference to help others discover and experience Gospel Spice. As always, we are praying for you. You can confidentially email us your prayer requests and praise items at the email address contact@gospelspice.com. It's our privilege to pray for you. So, I'll leave you with 4 things to do. Please pick one and do it at your convenience. 1. Sign up on our website for our newsletter to receive gifts you're going to love. 2. Find us on YouTube and see what content we've put together to help you grow closer to Jesus. 3. Rate Gospel Spice on your listening app. It's one of the easiest ways to share the gospel. And finally, 4. Tell us how we can pray for you. Merci.